the wargaming origins of RPGs. Tabletop role-playing began with Dungeons and Dragons. For people who are relatively new to the sport, I'm not going to get into the insanely bewildering number of editions and printings in the history of D&D. But I will quickly remind everyone that before there was D&D, there was Advanced D&D and Basic D&D, and right at the start, the original white box pamphlet format D&D. Actually, that might be something that would interest people, a family tree of D&D editions. Since the RPG community is currently going through a bit of growth and some of the people are therefore relatively new players, maybe they won't know that much about the old games. Of course, they might have very little interest in those older games, so where was I? Right. D&D was the very first TTRPG, and that's it. The beginning. The inception of the RPG. Only, of course, it isn't. D&D was partly derived from a wargame called Chainmail. While TTRPGs are younger than I am, wargames have a history that dates back much further. Chainmail was designed for medieval combat, as the name suggests, so it was pretty well suited to adoption for a fantasy RPG. Remember, the sort of wargames we're talking about here are classic tabletop types. Serious people with serious expressions, making measurements with serious tape measures, as they intricately recreate the War of the Seventh Coalition with hundreds of serious miniatures. Seriously. These days, I suspect people are more familiar with computer real-time strategy and simulation games, but computer games were much less common before the invention of the computer. It has occurred to me that D&D, weirdly, ended up being the least RP of the RPGs, despite inventing the form. I think part of that is down to it being the first. Every other game got to see what worked and what didn't in the mechanics of the game, sure, but they also got to try the RPG idea out, learn from experience, and focus on the bits they really enjoyed. Modern D&D is a modern RPG, arguably the definitive, full-featured modern RPG. What I find interesting is the extent to which every other RPG seemed to get modern earlier. I think this is because D&D was inspired by a wargame, whereas every other RPG was inspired by an RPG. D&D. So what do I mean by a modern RPG? Modern RPGs aren't for the most part distinguished by their core rules. To put it simply, there's not much wrong with the basic mechanics of the original D&D. If there was, then it would probably no longer be used as the core mechanics of the 5th edition, and, well, it mainly is. What makes a modern RPG, I think, is the supporting material and the official culture of the game. Sure, it's also the stunning art and design that has evolved over the years, but mainly it's the way that nowadays there seem to be all the rules you need without constantly tripping over ones that get between you and the RP part of the TTRPG. These days RPGs have as few rules as they can get away with. In the past there were tables of statistics for every imaginable situation. And why on earth were such tables needed? Because back in the mists of time, D&D was supposed to be a competitive event. You know, like a wargame. Players were supposed to earn points that rated them as superior to the player next to them. Many of the classic adventure modules were originally designed for so-called tournament play. At the end, the DM totted up the points earned by each player, and a winner was declared. There was almost no emphasis at all on the idea of the game being a collaborative story. It was player against player, with the DM as referee. But of course it was. It was derived from a wargame. In a wargame there's a winner and a loser. You earn victory points by capturing objectives and holding positions. It's odd, because it must have seemed strange to the early playtesters that the players were competing against each other at the same time as their characters were operating collaboratively. Now, it's quite possible I'm wrong about that, but I will say this. By the time I started playing, in about 1980-ish, the culture of D&D as seen in magazines, hobby shops, and in school games was nothing like the way convention tournaments were played in the US. In fact, I never played a tournament game at all. I have, however, played a lot of modules that were originally intended for tournament play. Many of the classic module booklets were adapted from tournament modules. Now, my knowledge of RPGs is far from exhaustive, but I can tell you that I don't recall ever coming across a tournament play module in any other rule system. We owe a great deal to D&D, those of us who play RPGs, but it's important to remember that we don't owe everything to D&D. The way the game is played now is more imaginative, more creative, less formal, and in every way better. Not only does much of that come from games other than the old lady herself, some of it seemed to emerge organically in direct opposition to the drumbeat of the official tournament modules and convention play reports. Modern D&D is obviously derived partly from its own former incarnations, but it's also derived from its players and even other RPGs, ones that owed their existence to D&D, but then fed back their own ideas, their own culture, into that RPG ecosystem. TTRPGs, it turns out, are symbiotic. They thrive because players play a multitude of rule sets, a multitude of campaigns and styles, just as much as because a given rule set has multiple players. It is this that has allowed all the RPG systems to get better, and this evolving style of gameplay, one that's far more flexible, far more creative, is now so clearly supported by newer editions of classic rules, as well as new rule sets designed for the current RPG culture. It's a very good time to be playing tabletop RPGs. So, credit to D&D, and credit to the other games that supported a more collaborative style from the beginning. And credit to the community, which took what they were given and moulded it into the creative activity it is now. Well, many thanks to anyone who stayed with me for this whole thing. If you picked and chose the sections that interested you, then many thanks for that as well, but I suspect you won't hear me say that. Anyway, I hope it was interesting. A couple of the segments were, well, part one of a series sort of thing, so if those were of interest, then that's even more encouraging. We can be found on Twitter at Boys Baltic, so follow us for updates on when we are streaming and what we're doing if you're interested. We regularly stream our ongoing Traveller campaign on Friday nights at 10:30 UK time, and we have a more varied stream every Thursday night at 11, also UK time. This week, on Thursday, we've got a very exciting event. We're going to have part 1, session 0 really, of a survival SF RPG called Those Dark Places. Our first session is going to be us learning about the game, generating our characters, and being terrified of everything. Luke is leading us through this one, which means I get to be a player and mess with his carefully planned universe for a change. So I'm really looking forward to that. If you have any ideas, questions, feedback, whatever, then please do let us know. The TTRPG community has been stunningly welcoming to us, really warm and enthusiastic, and we would always love to improve what we do. So, thank you very much, and for this episode, good night.